Well, I think I speak for a lot of us, for all of us. We wish we could be together. This is not how we planned Easter Sunday morning, is it? But I want to remind you today, that the first Easter did not happen in a church building. Can we remember that? The first Easter happened outside. It happened outside an empty tomb. And see if this sounds familiar. The first Christians were stuck at home. They were stuck at home and they were sad and they were scared and they were confused about what was going on. So it's a little ironic. I think we're a little closer to that first Easter than ever before, maybe, for us as a church. What are we doing here? Why is Easter such a big deal? What are we celebrating here on Easter Sunday morning? Well, let me be really clear. You know this, but I want to remind you, we're celebrating the biggest game changer in human history, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Almost 2,000 years ago, on a Thursday night, Jesus was arrested. Jesus was then tortured. It goes into Friday. Jesus was taken to a Roman cross and he was executed. He was killed. Now we know he did this on purpose. He was part of his mission. And then 2 days later, on Sunday, on Easter Sunday morning, this is what we're celebrating, God the Father raised God the Son, Jesus, back from the dead to life. And over 500 people saw him in the coming days and weeks. 500 eyewitness accounts, 500 plus. That's just the ones we know of that wrote about him, that talked about him, that the beginning of Christianity, it just exploded from there. What is Jesus coming back to life for you? What does it mean for me? What does it mean for us? I want to read one particular passage of Scripture this morning. So if you want to go there, that's where we'll be most of our time. We're going to look at 1 Peter. We're going to look at what Peter wrote. He was not only one of the first friends and followers of Jesus, and not only was he one of the first disciples of Jesus, but he was also one of the first eyewitness accounts of this event, of the resurrection of Jesus. So it's pretty cool to read what he wrote. We're going to look at 1 Peter chapter 1, starting in verse 3. Peter wrote this. He says, "All praise to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. It is by his great mercy that we have been born again, because God raised Jesus Christ from the dead." Because God raised Jesus from the dead, those of us who have chosen to put our whole faith in him, our trust in Jesus, we have been born again. That's this crazy spiritual term we see throughout the scripture. We have been given new life, a second life, because of him, because of Easter. And then what? What does the end of that verse says? It says, now we live with great expectation. Because of Easter, because of the resurrection of Jesus, and because therefore we have chosen to be born again in him, we have great expectations because of what God did. Another English translation of the same passage, if we're taking this original Greek text and we're looking how it's translated by different scholars into English, another translation says this. It says, because Jesus was raised from the dead, we've been given a brand new life, born again, and we have everything to live for. That's that great expectations. We have everything to live for. Another one translates that he has given us new birth into a living hope. As Christians, we have great expectations now in the wake of Easter. We have everything to live for. We have been given a living hope. You and I, if we trust God because of the resurrection of Jesus, we now have hope. We now have a living hope. So I want to ask you this Sunday morning, this Easter, do you have a living hope? Do you have hope? Are you expectant about the future? I can't think of a moment in my lifetime, I'm 50 years old, I can't think of a moment in my lifetime when we needed hope more than we do right now. Are you hopeful? I want to talk for a few minutes this morning about a living hope, a hope that I have. A hope that I'm eager to share with you, especially in the wake of COVID-19 and just the unique, challenging, difficult circumstances we face ourselves in. So let's back up. Let's talk first about why we even need this hope. Let's examine that. Why do we need this living hope? Well, why did Peter write this letter to these people and explaining to them about this living hope? What did he know that they needed? They needed the same thing we do. They were suffering. They were struggling. They were going through really hard times. In fact, we can read just a few lines later in verse 6. Peter's telling them, be truly glad. There is wonderful joy ahead, even though you have to endure many trials for a little while. He's saying you're going to have to endure. The first Christians, I don't know what you know about the first Christians in history. We think life is hard for us. The first Christians really struggled. The first Christians were persecuted for their faith. They were robbed. Some of them were beaten. Some of them were imprisoned. Some of them were killed. We think we've got it rough. Even right now, we think we've got it really rough. The first Christians really struggled, and Peter knew this. And there's no way to get through life unless you know how to get through suffering. That's a fact. You want to know how to be a good parent? A lot of you do. You want to know how to be successful in business? You want to know how to be a great leader, a great spouse? You want to know how to do something really well? Well, all these things we want to know how to do well, but this is a fact. There's no way to get through life unless you know how to get through suffering. And there's no way to get through suffering unless you have a living hope. A lot of you know I grew up in Germany. I've shared this before. When I was 10 years old, my family moved across the Atlantic Ocean to the southern part of what was then called West Germany. It was Stuttgart. And we lived there for a long time. I lived there all the way through my junior high and high school years. And because of that, I became very engaged with World War II history. This is back in the 1980s. So it was just a few decades away from what happened there, specifically with Nazi Germany. And so I got to learn so much. I became a student of World War II, even as a kid. I got to go places like Nazi concentration camps and walk onto the camp and walk into what looked like showers, but were the gas chambers where they killed people. I got to walk into the actual oven chambers where they would burn the bodies. I got to see where they bunked. I got to get just a sense of the horrific conditions that they lived through. I got to read a lot about history. And I say that because I want to share about Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a brilliant Austrian neurologist and a psychiatrist. He ended up being in these concentration camps. He was a Holocaust survivor and an author. So he wrote a lot of things about that experience. And he says there were 4 ways people responded to these awful circumstances, to suffering. 4 ways people responded in the death camps. Frankl said that some people became cruel. Even the nicest of people, he writes this, he's like, even the people you would never guess, it was very disturbing, he says, because the way they would start to treat each other, that's just what happened as a result of their pain. Some of them were really cruel. Some people just gave up. They just gave up. Frankl writes this, he says, many prisoners just lost all hope, and with all hope, they lost a spiritual hold. Usually this happened quite suddenly. The symptoms of which were familiar to us experienced camp inmates. We all feared for this moment in our friends. Usually it began one morning when the prisoner simply refused to get dressed or go out to the parade grounds for inspection. No entreaties, no blows, no threats had any effect. They just lay there. They had given up. Nothing bothered them anymore because they had no hope. Wow. Here's a dramatic example, he writes. He says, my senior block warden, a well-known composer and librettist. I had to look that word up. I didn't know what a librettist was. If you know what librettist, jump into the comments section, jump into the chat room, explain real quick how smart you are. What's a librettist? I had to look it up. A librettist is someone who creates lyrics for operas or maybe ballets. So evidently, Frankl says, my senior block warden, a well-known composer and librettist, once told me he had a dream that the war was going to end March 30th. He was convinced his dream was a revelation, and as the day drew nearer, it became clear from news reports that the war was not going to end. On March 29th, he suddenly began running a high temperature. On March 30th, his day, he lost consciousness. And on March 31st, he was dead. The loss of hope had lowered his body's resistance to all the diseases in the camp. Some people just gave up. They were so overwhelmed with grief, so overwhelmed with pain, they just gave up. Others, Frankl writes, just tried to hold on. Things are really hard. If we can just make it, if we can just hold on. Frankl said a lot of people held on by saying, if I can just survive, I can get all my hopes back. He writes, many held on through the hope that if they stayed alive, their health, family, professional achievements, fortune, and position in society, those things that had been their hope, would be restored. They could get their hope back. But after liberation, so many found that when the day of their dreams had finally come, it was much different than what they longed for. Many people went into deep depression for the rest of their lives after their liberation, or even committed suicide. Some people just tried to hold on. And there was a fourth group. This was a small group of people that handled it differently than everybody else. They didn't just give up. They didn't just try to hold on. They didn't start acting cruel to the people around them. No, they acted very different. What was the difference for them? Frankel writes this. He says, only a few of the prisoners kept their full inner liberty and obtained an inner strength that raised them above their outward fate. Some people found an inner strength. Very different from the rest. Some people found an inner strength. And what makes this difference? Frankel got specific. He said, life in the concentration camp tears open the human soul and exposes its depths and its foundation. And what is the foundation? What I would tell people is life only has meaning if we have a hope that even suffering and death cannot destroy. It's insightful. Which makes me want to ask you, what is your foundation? I mean, life is hard, right? Life is hard for a lot of us right now. Life's going to be hard. If it's not COVID-19, it's going to be something else. This life is hard. This life is going to be hard. What is your foundation? Where is your hope? Where is your future hope? Where does it lie? What your future hope is completely determines how you handle your now. I've been thinking about that a lot the last couple weeks. Where your future hope is, what your future hope is, completely determines how you handle your now. If I make any finite object my future hope, I mean, what does suffering look like? It looks like that thing being stripped away, being taken away from me. If I make my home my hope, my source of joy, if I make my business or my stuff my future hope, what is suffering but just the taking away of that? If I even make my spouse or my kids, my family, what is suffering? Suffering is that being taken away from me. And suffering will come. Some of us know that right now. Some of us have already experienced that before. How will we respond when things get really hard? Some of us will become cruel in ways we never thought we would. Some of us will just give up. It'll be sad to watch. We will just get so passive, feel so isolated, feel so depressed, we will just give up. Some of us, probably a lot of us, will just try to hold on. Does that sound familiar for some of you? We're just gonna try to hold on and make it until it gets better again. Here's our reality. Unless you and I get a spiritual, living hope, we will not be able to handle suffering. I really believe that. Unless we get a spiritual, living hope, we will not be able to handle suffering. We need a living hope that is supernatural, that is gifted to us from above, from our Creator, who of all people can provide it for us. And how does this work in our lives? How does this living hope work out in our lives? Let's look at verse 6 again in 1 Peter. 1 Peter 1, chapter 6. He writes, so be truly glad. There is wonderful joy ahead, even though you have to endure many trials for a little while. Okay, don't miss this, okay? I want us to notice a couple of things. Peter's not saying to us, hey, let's just put on a smile. Let's just fake it. Hey, don't worry, be happy. I think some people think that's what Christians are. I think some of us Christians think that's what we're supposed to be. No, Peter actually makes some pretty big points here. Check this out. The first part of that verse, be truly glad. So be truly glad. That's present tense. Be truly glad now. And then look at the last part of the verse. The last part of the verse, he says, verse 6, he says, even though you have to endure many trials for a little while. That's also present tense. Be glad now. You have to endure some really hard things now. And then in the middle, he talks about this joy that is coming, right? I think it's really important for us to notice, Peter doesn't say, okay, you used to be glad, now life's really hard, now you're suffering. He's not saying that. He's not saying, okay, you used to be suffering, it was awful, now you have joy. Now you can be glad. No, and he's not even saying, okay, you're suffering now, but just hold on tight because eventually things are going to get better. Eventually there's a joy that's coming. He's not even saying that. No, it's deeper than that. Peter is saying that as Christians, we can be filled with real joy at the exact same time we can be filled with real sadness, real sorrow. And that's really different than a lot of what we see around us at times. Really different than maybe what we experience. Most people think this is impossible. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any sense. Most people think, how can you have a living hope when the very things that give you hope have been taken away? When we lose our money, when we lose our health, when we lose our relationships. You can't be filled with joy when the very things that give you joy are taken away, right? And the reason so many people think this way is because so many people have their joy tied to their circumstances. And I'm not just talking to non-Christians out there. I'm talking to all of us. I'm talking to us Christians. So many of us have this misperception, this wrong belief. No, this is a belief held by way too many of us. Well, life will be hard at times, and I won't have joy, but there'll be other really good times and I'll have joy. And then there'll be some other hard things I'll go through and I won't have any joy, but then there'll be some good times again and I'll find joy, and it's tied to our circumstances. Here's the deep thought of the day. This is about as deep as I can even try to be. The new birth, being reborn in Jesus, it drastically and utterly changes the relationship between joy and sorrow in our lives. This is what happens as a result of Easter, as a result of the resurrection. We are reborn in Jesus. If we choose to trust him and follow him, and what that means for us is it completely changes the relationship between joy and sorrow in our lives. Sorrow can actually increase our joy as Christians. We can actually experience deep, painful sorrow and at the same time experience real, deep joy. In fact, a living hope not based in circumstance means that when things are taken away, like a lot of things we're experiencing right now, they've been taken away, they're going to be maybe taken away. This sorrow, this sadness that's legit, that's real, it actually drives us into Jesus. It actually drives us into joy in him. We are driven into Jesus, our living hope. Here's a true statement. I've thought about this and I'm not exaggerating. The most joy-filled people that I have ever encountered in my life, I'm 50 years old, the most joy-filled people I've ever met, I've ever come to know in my life have been Christians who have gone through really hard things. It's true. You would think it'd be the people, maybe the younger people who have yet to suffer in some major way, or some people, somehow they've lived a charmed life and they've gotten through and they really haven't struggled that much. You would think those would be the most joy-filled people that I've ever encountered. Nope. The most joy-filled people I've ever encountered, without exception, are Christians who have gone through really hard things. There is a depth of life that is found only in Jesus, only in the living hope that he offers, which really means for us as Christians, check out this crazy thought, a living hope actually makes us both sadder and happier. I guess if we're looking for some really simplistic, feel-good message, that's not it, right? Come to Jesus, become a Christian, and you will just be happier, your best life now, right? That's not from the scriptures. No. A living hope actually makes us both sadder and happier. It's a beautiful depth that God offers us, a depth of life that is only found in Jesus. This depth includes both our sorrow and our joy. Okay, let's be clear about this living hope. What is it? Some of you are like, I would like some of that. Would you sign me up for some of that? Okay, what is it and how do we get it? Let's look at what Peter writes again. This is 1 Peter chapter 1, back to verse 3. He says, it is by his great mercy that we have been born again, because God raised Jesus Christ from the dead. Now we live with great expectation. Now we live with a living hope, something worth living for. And then what is it? He goes on to explain. Let's keep reading the next few verses. He says this living hope, it's a priceless inheritance. Next verse. We have a priceless inheritance, an inheritance that is kept in heaven for you, pure and undefiled, beyond the reach of change and decay. It's there for us. It's waiting for us. It's protected. The change in this world is not going to affect that inheritance that is coming our way. The brokenness, the decay in this world cannot negatively impact that priceless inheritance that is ours. This is this living hope we have. And then he goes on to say it's our salvation. It's our rescue. Verse 5, and through your faith, God is protecting you by his power until you receive this salvation, this rescue, which is ready to be revealed on the last day for all to see. This rescue is ours. This is our living hope. And it's our joy. We already read this verse. So be truly glad. Find joy now. There is wonderful joy ahead, even though you have to endure many trials for a little while. This living hope gives us joy down the road to look forward to for sure, and it gives us the ability to find joy now. And then finally, here's the weirdest part for me, but this is true. This living hope gives us praise and glory and honor. Verse 7. These trials, this hard stuff we're going through, will show that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold, though your faith is far more precious than mere gold. So, when your faith remains strong through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world. Okay, I didn't catch this the first 15, 20 times I read this line, and it just jumped out to me. Check this out. We think praise and honor and glory, that's for God. That's for the King of the universe. We worship him. Praise, glory, honor. We sing that, we say that, we pray that, we read it. But did you catch this? This praise and glory and honor is for you. It's for us because of this living hope. Let me read that part again, the last part of verse 7. So when your faith remains strong through many trials, when you're faithful through the hardest of times, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world. That's crazy cool. Crazy cool. What is a living hope? It's our priceless inheritance that's waiting for us, that cannot be taken away. It's our salvation, our rescue that we desperately need. It's our joy, our depth of joy. It's our praise and glory and honor. It's crazy cool. And how do we get it? How do we get it? Well, back to this first verse we've read 3 or 4 times now, verse 3. Peter says, it is by his great mercy, it is by his mercy, his forgiveness, his tenderness, his kindness, that we have been born again. Because God raised Christ Jesus from the dead. Now we live with great expectation. Now we have this living hope. So I got to ask you today, how have you responded to his mercy, his tenderness, his kindness? How have you responded? How have you received forgiveness for all your rebellion, for your selfishness, for the things you think are so unforgivable? Maybe the things nobody else knows about. How have you responded to his mercy that he offers to us every day, all day? How have you responded? Do you have a living hope? In the words of Peter, have you been reborn? Have you been born again? I think about this joy that overcomes suffering that's just offered to us, this perspective that's radically different, this hope that defies circumstances, and it takes me back to when I finally dove in, when I finally decided, I'm going to choose to trust Jesus. I'm going to trust him alone. I'm not going to tie my hope and my joy to circumstances. I'm going to tie it all to the person of Jesus. It was my sophomore year of college at Baylor. I was 20 years old. I think I came to the proverbial end of my rope, and everything changed after that. Life changed after that. I chose to put my trust in him. I chose to love him back. He's been loving me for 20 years to that point, and I chose to love him back. And it's a choice I make every day. It's a choice I make every day, all day, to make him first. It's a choice I struggle to be faithful to make him king. This is how we obtain this inner strength that Viktor Frankl was writing about. This is how we find this living hope. And finally, once we get it, maybe the last important question for us to wrestle with today is, how do we live in it? How do we live out of this place of living hope? Well, it's choosing faith. Faith is this, it's this mystery. It's believing in things we can't see. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 8. This is a great finish to this section. Peter's talking to these same people, and he says, you love him, even though you have never seen him. Though you do not see him now, you trust him. And you rejoice with a glorious, inexpressible joy. Okay, we're trying to figure out, how do we live in this? How did Jesus do it? Let's go back real quick to the first Easter ever. That awful, wonderful, terribly tragic, beautiful first Easter weekend. How did Jesus respond to suffering? He went through, I just watched Passion of the Christ with Carrie and Abby and Emily, my oldest two, on Friday, and it's painful to watch. I hadn't seen it actually in a few years. My oldest girls hadn't seen it at all. And I was just reminded again, the lengths that Jesus went to, the physical suffering that he chose, the emotional and spiritual suffering that he just invited upon himself. How did he respond to this awful suffering? Is there any evidence that at one point Jesus just prayed, he cried out, would you just make me strong? Help me overcome this with great strength and power? No, there's no evidence of that. Is there any evidence of Jesus thinking or praying or saying out loud, you know what, I'm just going to hold on. I'm just going to make it through. This is really bad 24 hours, but I'm just going to hold on. It's all going to pass. No. How did Jesus endure? As we think about how do we endure? How do we live out of this living hope? How did Jesus endure the worst time of his human life here on earth? Well, we don't have to guess. I'm so grateful. We don't have to guess. I found this in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. It says very succinctly, it says, because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Because of the joy awaiting him. What was the joy awaiting Jesus? Let's think about this for a moment. There's this joy out ahead of him. What was that joy that was awaiting Jesus that allowed him to endure the worst things to go through? Well, it would make sense, I guess, at first thought that it was heaven. It was that Jesus was going to again get to be in the presence of God the Father. He was going to get to be in heaven where everything's perfect and wonderful and there's no pain. And he was just looking forward to that. That was the joy that awaited him. But then I thought about it, that doesn't make any sense because Jesus already had that. Why would Jesus, God the Son, who was in the presence of God the Father, he was in heaven where there's no pain, everything's wonderful, why would he choose to leave, to come and live with us so that he would get to go to heaven and be with God the Father? That doesn't make any sense. So what is this joy that awaited the Son, that awaited Jesus, that empowered him, allowed him to endure the worst of times? Well, Isaiah speaks to this, thankfully. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 11, talks about Jesus and says this, when he sees all that is accomplished by his anguish, he will be satisfied. And because of his experience, my righteous servant will make it possible for many to be counted righteous, for he will bear all their sins. When he sees all that is accomplished by his anguish, he will be satisfied. This is why Jesus cried out on the cross right before he took his last breath, these words, it is finished. Another English translation, it is accomplished, done, it's done. This is why he said these words, this payment for our sin. This was the joy he was awaiting. The price he knew he wanted to pay for our sake. Did you know that you were the joy that awaited the Lord. You and I, we were his living hope that allowed him, empowered him to endure the worst of times. Until it's that personal for you, you won't have a living hope. Do you know this? Do you get this? Until it's that personal for you, you will not have a living hope. This Easter thing, it's really personal. It's not just a history lesson. It's not just a religious calendar day. It's not just spiritual truth. It's deeply personal for you. It's deeply personal for me, for us. It's about a relationship. It's about a love relationship, a trust relationship. Can I read that verse one last time? 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 8. Does this sound like religion? Does this sound like some kind of moralistic code or philosophy of life? Listen to verse 8. You love him, even though you have never seen him. Though you do not see him now, you trust him, and you rejoice with a glorious, inexpressible joy. The reward for trusting him will be the salvation of your souls. I don't know how else to say it. I love him, and I've never seen him. I trust him, and I can't see him. He has filled me with a joy that I can't find the words to adequately express. He's given me a hope, a living hope that defies circumstance, that gives me depth of joy and sorrow. Jesus has given me a living hope that changes everything.